She sat alone at the edge of the compound, hands pressed gently over her stomach. The late morning breeze carried the scent of rain and wood smoke, but her thoughts floated far beyond the trees and rooftops. Nafisa, 26, had spent 4 years waiting for this moment, 4 years of wondering if her body was broken, if her prayers had gone unheard. But now the test in the clinic's quiet room had whispered the words her heart longed for. She was with child. She had not screamed, not even smiled when the nurse confirmed it. Just a long inhale, as if she were finally breathing after being underwater too long. On the walk back, her steps were lighter, but her expression stayed flat. The village did not let women celebrate too soon. Joy, especially a woman's joy, was best kept secret until it passed inspection. At home, her husband Musa noticed first. He had grown used to her silence over the years, and now, the way she carried her body differently, like she was holding something fragile and sacred, spoke louder than words. He came to her that night, quietly, like a man entering a shrine. For the first time in months, he touched her without duty, without resentment. Just hands against skin and a long exhale between them. He asked nothing. She answered nothing. But in the space between his fingers and her belly, something unspoken stirred. The next morning, Al-Hajja noticed. Her mother-in-law had spent years throwing side comments about barrenness, always coded in religion and proverbs. But this day she brought boiled yam to Nafisa's corner, not saying why, just placing the food down and sitting for a while. Not beside her, but close enough to watch her face. That was the first sign of a shift. Word moved in silence. A neighbor's nod held more meaning than a drumbeat. Aunties began appearing again, slowly, with bowls of groundnut soup and old wives' tales about avoiding spicy food and drinking bitter leaf water at dawn. No one said, "Congratulations," not yet, but the way they watched her, the way they lingered by the fence, it was clear, they knew. Still, Nafisa was told, "Keep quiet until the baby is born." Evil eyes listen more closely than kind hearts. It was her mother who whispered this, the same woman who once told her she was worthless if she could not bear fruit. Now she pressed amulets into Nafisa's palm and warned, "Joy must be covered in silence. Let no one steal it from your womb." So Nafisa hid it. She wrapped her joy in cloth and buried it under quiet movements. She washed clothes with care, bent only halfway, and avoided the market crowds. Her lips stayed soft and still, even when her belly began to grow under her wrapper. She wrote her happiness in a journal no one would ever read, scribbled prayers to a child whose heartbeat she could not hear, but already loved more than anything. Musa began returning home earlier from the farm. He no longer argued with her over meals or stared too long at the door after dinner. Sometimes he'd place his hand lightly on her back as they walked. These small gestures were not apologies for the past years, but they were something. They were better than silence. But the pressure was growing even as her belly barely showed. The unspoken expectations, the hidden countdown, the quiet competition with other women who had birthed children and walked proudly through the village with infants on their backs. Nafisa felt the weight in every look, every half-smile. If she lost this child, they would not say it was misfortune. They would say it was her fault. Her womb. Her weakness. She smiled when necessary, but only halfway. The full smile, the one that lives in a woman's eyes, not just her lips, remained locked away. She feared that if she smiled too freely, fate would come and snatch it back. In the evenings, she would sit near the mango tree where children played, and dream of the child growing inside her. A girl? A boy? It didn't matter. She imagined small feet pattering against wet earth, laughter echoing against compound walls, and a tiny hand gripping hers in trust. She imagined what it might feel like to finally be enough. But even those dreams she didn't dare share. Musa would only nod when she mentioned names. Al-Hajja would frown if she smiled too brightly. Neighbors would ask too many questions, dig too deeply. So she carried the joy the way her people taught her, wrapped in silence, layered in hope, covered in fear. Because in her world, a woman's worth was measured not in her love, her work, or her mind, but in what her belly could carry to term. And if she failed again, no one would carry her. She would fall alone. Again. But for now she walked gently, spoke softly, prayed silently, smiled just halfway. The morning started like every other. Mist clung to the edges of the trees, and dew softened the earth beneath her feet. Nafisa tied her wrapper tight around her waist and balanced the water pot on her head. Her movements were slower now, gentler, mindful of the precious life she carried inside her. She hummed softly as she walked the narrow path to the stream, her fingers brushing the leaves for balance. The world still felt delicate, like glass underfoot, but there was rhythm in her steps, a quiet confidence forming with each day that passed. But that morning something shifted. Halfway back from the stream as she neared the rocky bend by the tamarind tree, a sudden pain gripped her lower belly, sharp, twisting, unrelenting. The water pot shook, then slid off her head, crashing onto the earth as she gasped and stumbled. Her knees buckled, and before she could call for help, she collapsed beside the pot, clutching her stomach, trying to breathe, trying not to scream. The world spun. The air was too thick to swallow. A young girl, Aisha from the neighboring compound, saw her fall and rushed toward her, barefoot and wide-eyed. "Auntie Nafisa! Auntie Nafisa!" she cried, shaking her shoulders, voice trembling. Nafisa couldn't speak. She only blinked, tears slipping from the corners of her eyes as waves of pain washed over her. The girl ran, calling for help, her voice echoing through the morning haze. She was carried to the clinic by two men from the village. She heard their breathing more than their words. The thin curtain of the clinic fluttered in the dry wind as they laid her on the narrow bed. Her wrapper was soaked with sweat, her fingers clenched the sheet beneath her. The nurse didn't smile. She pressed the cold end of the fetal scope against Nafisa's belly and moved it slowly in circles. Her eyes avoided Nafisa's face. She listened. Then listened again. Then a third time. Nothing. She tried the Doppler machine. Adjusted the gel. Turned the volume up. Still nothing. Nafisa's eyes locked onto the nurse's face, searching desperately for even a flicker of hope. But the nurse simply placed the device down and gently placed a hand on Nafisa's shoulder. That single gesture said everything. Nafisa turned her face away and stared at the cracked ceiling. She didn't cry. Not yet. The doctor came in, cleared his throat, and muttered something about these things happening. He said she was still young. That there was hope for next time. That her body just needed to rest. Sometimes it's for the best, he added, not realizing how those words scraped against her like thorns. Her palms rested on her now empty belly. She pressed down lightly, almost as if trying to wake it up. Maybe the baby was just sleeping. Maybe they had made a mistake. But her hands felt what the machines had already confirmed: emptiness. When she returned home, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth and silence, Al-Hajja did not weep. She did not ask how it happened. She did not even say sorry. She simply said, "Don't tell anyone. It will bring shame." Nafisa sat at the edge of the room, her back against the wall, her legs folded under her, eyes glassy. The sounds of the compound continued, children laughing in the distance, goats bleating, someone pounding yam. Life moved on indifferent. Musa did not speak to her that evening. Or the next after that. He entered the room, ate quietly, and turned his back toward her before sleeping. When she stirred, he stayed still, his breathing heavy and distant. She waited for him to ask how she felt, to hold her even briefly, to whisper something, anything. But he was a man raised to believe that grief was a woman's duty, and silence was how real men coped. She bled for 3 days. Softly. Alone. A pain deeper than flesh seeped through her, spreading into every corner of her bones. Al-Hajja brought her hot soup on the 4th day, but her eyes never met Nafisa's. She said, "Sit still. Drink this. Rest. Try again later." No one lit a candle. No one offered prayers. No one asked what she had named the child in her heart. There was no funeral. Only a slow, cold quietness that filled the compound like mist that never lifted. The women in the neighborhood didn't come by with bowls of soup this time. They whispered from a distance, eyes darting when Nafisa passed. Some clucked their tongues in pity. Others in blame. It didn't matter. In the evenings, Nafisa would sit under the tree again like before. But this time she didn't imagine baby names or tiny footsteps. She just sat, listening, watching, numb. At night, when the house fell silent, she'd press her palm to her stomach and try to remember what it felt like, before the pain, before the absence, before her joy slipped away in red silence. She wasn't told to mourn, only to recover. She wasn't told to cry, only to stay quiet. And so, Nafisa did what many women before her had done: she swallowed the loss. Let it settle deep into her ribs, where no one would notice it, where no one would dare ask. But her silence wasn't peace. It was survival. Wrapped in grief, draped in shame. And still, no one said her name with softness. Not even herself. The days after the miscarriage melted into one another, like oil spreading through water, visible but impossible to contain. Nafisa moved through the village like a shadow of herself, not weeping, not screaming, just breathing with effort. She swept the compound, boiled rice, and washed Musa's clothes with the same quiet rhythm, but the pulse behind her eyes was different now. Something inside her had shifted, not just from the loss, but from how the world around her demanded she behave after it. People saw her but didn't look too long. They knew what had happened, though no one said it aloud. It hung in the air, between greetings, behind gestures, in the silence when she passed a group of women and the conversation faltered. They would smile politely, then quickly look away. The ones who had once praised her for finally becoming a real woman, now pitied her or avoided her entirely. In the village of Takua, miscarriage was not just a loss, it was a blemish. Something that made women less blessed, less reliable, less whole. It was the unspoken belief that some wombs were simply cursed. That no matter how much they prayed or how much their husbands paid in bride price, these women would never bring forth life. The men didn't say it directly. They didn't need to. It lived in how they stopped talking when their wives entered the room, or how they nodded when elders said, "Some women are just not meant to carry legacy." Nafisa had heard those things all her life, but now she was wearing it. Not like cloth. Like a brand. She began to notice the other women who lived in similar silence. One afternoon as she walked back from the market, a grieving widow named Dija pulled her aside near the millet stall. Dija was a woman whose laughter had long faded, her eyes permanently swollen as if tears had stained them. Dija's voice was low. "It happened to me too," she said, almost without moving her lips. 3 times before my husband died. Nobody held my hand. Not even once. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. They only told me to keep trying. To be strong. To be silent. Nafisa blinked, unsure how to respond. But in that single moment, a bond formed, between 2 women linked by invisible loss. Another time, Nafisa stayed behind after the adult literacy class she had been attending. The schoolteacher, Miss Salma, a composed, educated woman who wore her hair in elegant twists, sat beside her as the other women trickled out. "I heard what happened," Salma said gently, not like gossip but like concern. "You don't have to answer me. But I want you to know. I was once engaged. And I lost a baby. His family said I brought death into their lineage." The man left without saying goodbye. Nafisa's throat tightened. She hadn't expected it. Not from Salma, who always stood tall, who always looked like she had never been bruised by life. "He left?" Nafisa asked, voice barely audible. "Yes," Salma replied. "And I thought I would die from shame. But one day I stopped asking why. And I started asking, what now?" That night, Nafisa found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the window with only the moonlight and the soft hum of crickets for company. Her fingers ached, not from work but from holding everything in for too long. The heaviness in her chest had no name, only weight. She remembered something her late grandmother once gave her, a small leather book stitched by hand and wrapped in red cloth. It had been tucked in the bottom of her wooden box for years, untouched. That night she pulled it out. At first, the pen trembled in her grip. The pages stared back blank, unjudging. She didn't know where to begin, so she simply wrote, "I miss you. I didn't even meet you. But I miss you. I felt your flutter before I heard your silence." She kept writing. Not to explain. Not to impress. Just to release. "I don't know if you were a boy or a girl. I don't know if I was strong enough to carry you. But I tried. I wanted to." Each word spilled from a wound too deep for doctors to find. Her anger. Her shame. Her questions. Her fury at the silence. Her sorrow for the little life she had imagined but never held. The next afternoon she went to the herbalist, Mama Talito, under the pretense of buying Morina leaves. Mama Talito was an old midwife, one who had birthed half the village and buried more secrets than she could count. When Nafisa mentioned her writing, Mama Talito looked up sharply. "You write?" "Yes," Nafisa said quietly. "Only at night. When it hurts too much." Mama Talita nodded. "Good. Don't stop. You will never heal if you carry their silence. Let your voice bleed, child. Better that than your spirit." That sentence rang inside Nafisa's chest for days. It echoed every time someone passed by and chose not to speak. It echoed when Musa sat beside her at dinner and still couldn't say her name. It echoed when her mother sent herbs and said only, "Try again when you are stronger." So Nafisa wrote. And kept writing. She wrote about her body, how it felt before and after. She wrote about the dreams she once had. She wrote about how she watched other women walk with their children and felt both joy and rage. She wrote about the day she collapsed by the stream, the ceiling in the clinic, the nurse's eyes. She wrote about Musa's silence, about Alhaj's bitterness, about the girls who whispered behind walls. She wrote until her handwriting became steadier. Until the lines between pain and power blurred. Her words were no longer just grief. They were survival. They were memory. They were fire. Each night, she would light a small lamp, open the leather book and return to herself. And slowly, line by line, Nafisa began to understand. She had lost a child, but she would not lose herself. The sun was high and unforgiving when Nafisa entered the community hall, a low-roofed mud structure with wooden benches arranged in a semicircle. The monthly village women's gathering had always been a mixture of gossip, cultural instructions and thinly veiled judgment. Today was no different. The room buzzed with conversation as women of all ages fanned themselves with folded palm leaves, their wrappers rustling with each shift. Nafisa found a seat in the back, her leather notebook clutched tightly in her lap, her fingers gripping its edges like it could protect her. She hadn't planned to speak. She had only come because Mama Talita mentioned that the elders would be discussing women's responsibilities this time, and Nafisa had started paying closer attention to those words. They were rarely about power and always about pain. The meeting began with the village elderwoman, Mama Bintu, clearing her throat and rising with slow, deliberate grace. Her eyes, clouded with age, still carried enough strength to quiet the room with a single glance. "We are losing something in our girls," she began. "They learn to dress, to dance, to talk smart. But are they learning to carry lineage? To hold families together? We must return to what matters. A girl must be taught how to be a strong wife, and a strong womb." A low hum of agreement rippled through the room. Women nodded. A few clapped softly. Nafisa sat motionless. Her hands tightened around the book. Another woman spoke next. It was Musa's mother, Al-Haja, her voice sharp, proud, and cold. "Some women don't try hard enough," she said, casting her eyes vaguely toward the back where Nafisa sat her day. "They drink herbs one day, then claim to be mothers the next. It takes more than hope to keep a baby. It takes discipline. Faith. Not everyone is built for it." No one looked directly at Nafisa, but she could feel it. The weight of invisible eyes, the whispers wrapped in silence. She could hear her own heartbeat louder than the elder's voice as it continued speaking in the distance. Her chest felt tight. Her throat dry. The notebook in her lap pulsed like a heartbeat, the pages filled with stories no one in that room had heard. She felt a storm rising in her chest, fury, sadness, shame, and the fragile beginnings of courage, all swirling at once. She could have spoken then. She could have stood up and told them that strength was not in silent suffering. That no wound deserved blame for pain. That she had tried with everything she had, prayers, potions, patience, and still life had left her belly empty. She wanted to ask them if they thought grief was laziness. If crying in the dark, alone, night after night, made her any less of a woman. If they knew what it felt like to hope so loudly inside and be told to keep it quiet outside. But her lips refused to part. Her voice stayed hidden behind the same wall of fear she had grown up with. She stayed seated. So, the storm inside her did not settle. It only simmered. She looked down at her notebook. The leather binding was warm under her hands. She remembered the words she had written the night before. "They blame my womb like it chose to break. But no one blames the wind when it refuses to carry rain." She wanted to read it aloud. Just that line. Just once. But she didn't. The meeting continued. Talk shifted to the price of yams, and which daughter had married into which family. The storm passed, at least for them. When it ended, the women stood, some stretching, others laughing, their burdens tucked back into quiet corners. Nafisa rose slowly, her legs heavy, the notebook pressed to her chest like a shield. No one spoke to her directly. No one needed to. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip low behind the trees. The shadows stretched long across the ground as she walked home alone, her slippers kicking up dust with each slow step. She didn't cry, but her eyes burned. From anger. From exhaustion. From holding too much. The village was alive with evening noise, goats bleating, pots clanging, distant voices calling children in for supper. But the night wrapped around her like wet cloth. Heavy. Damp. Unforgiving. She passed women laughing at the well, men playing cards by the roadside, and a boy dragging a stick through the dirt. Life continued as if she did not ache. When she reached her compound, Musa was not home. Again. She didn't wait for him. She sat by the firewood, opened the notebook slowly, and wrote just one sentence before the moon took her into sleep. "If silence is strength, then why does it feel like I am breaking?" The heat of the day had settled into a thick, still quiet. The sun was dipping low, and the sky was heavy with clouds that looked like they wanted to cry but had forgotten how. Nafisa was coming back from Mama Talita's compound, where she'd picked up fresh neem leaves, when she heard a rustle, too soft to be a goat, too urgent to be wind. She paused by the bushy path that led behind the yam fields. Then she heard it, a faint whimper so hushed it almost disappeared into the air. Curious and cautious, Nafisa moved toward the sound. There, behind a thicket of wild cassava, lay a girl, curled into herself like a wounded animal. Her wrapper was soaked with blood. Her fingers clawed at the soil. Her face, young, frightened, familiar. It was Safina, the 17-year-old girl from the next compound. Her eyes were wild, cheeks streaked with silent tears. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't calling for help. She was bleeding. Alone. Nafisa dropped everything and knelt beside her. "Oh God, oh my child," she whispered, reaching out. Safina flinched at first. Then, when she saw who it was, she simply closed her eyes, like someone finally surrendering. "I didn't know what to do," Safina murmured. "I didn't know who to tell." Nafisa didn't ask questions. She didn't need to know the father's name or the story. She didn't care whether there was shame or blame. She just reached for the herbs she had, tore a strip from her own wrapper, and began wiping the blood away. She held Safina's hand tight. Murmured soothing words. Pressed warm water to her lips. Waited with her until the trembling calmed. When Safina finally cried, Nafisa cried too. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she knew exactly what it meant to be silenced in pain. When they finally got her up, Nafisa helped her home through a back path where no one would see. She brought her dried okra soup the next day. She came in silence and left in silence, but every time their eyes met, something deep and wordless passed between them. A contract. A knowing. It stayed with Nafisa all day and all night, the way Safina had tried to bleed quietly, the way she had curled herself into shadows, the way she had nearly died out of fear. And something inside Nafisa cracked. She stared at her notebook for hours that evening. It lay open in her lap like a mirror, all its pages filled with truth that no one had yet heard. Her pen hovered above a blank space. Then she wrote, "I used to think silence was strength. But today I saw a child try to die quietly and I realized, it is not dignity. It is a cage." The words startled her. Because for the first time she was not just writing to release the weight inside her. She was writing to build something. Something bigger than herself. Something that might echo past her own chest. She rose from her mat, slipped on her shawl and walked out into the night. The road to Miss Salma's house was dark, but Nafisa didn't feel fear this time. The moonlight gave just enough visibility to guide her steps, and the crickets sang like a drumbeat under her feet. When she knocked, Miss Salma was grading school papers by lantern light. She looked up, surprised but warm. "Nafisa?" Nafisa didn't sit. She held the notebook in front of her like it was a plea. "I want to speak," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know where or how. But I want them to hear me." Salma blinked slowly. Then she put down her pen and motioned for Nafisa to sit. "Start here," she said softly. "Let me hear you first." Nafisa opened the notebook. Her fingers trembled. Her throat felt dry. But she read anyway. She read about the moment she first felt life inside her, and the moment she felt it leave. She read about the cracked ceiling at the clinic and the way silence echoed louder than screams. She read about the women who looked away, the ones who judged her, and the ones who hurt silently beside her. She read about Safina. When she finished, Miss Salma didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "You are not just mourning. You are witnessing. And this village needs witnesses. Not just survivors." Nafisa pressed the notebook to her chest again. She didn't feel healed. But for the first time since her miscarriage she felt visible. Felt like her pain might do something more than bruise her, it might bloom. She walked back home under the same moon, her footsteps slower but steadier. Her voice had not risen in the meeting. It had not echoed through the village yet. But now it had been spoken. Heard. A seed planted. And like any seed, it only needed one thing to grow: light. The sun rose differently that morning, casting a pale gold over the village like a blessing, or a warning. Women were already gathering at the schoolyard by the time Nafisa arrived. Some came out of curiosity, others with folded arms and guarded eyes. Al-Hajja had refused to come. Musa stood far in the back, not part of the gathering but close enough to watch. He hadn't said much that morning, just the same sentence he'd repeated for 3 days. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" She did. But it didn't make her any less afraid. Miss Salma had spent weeks preparing the forum. She called it the Circle of Women's Health and Healing, but everyone in the village called it the Day of the Speaking Girl. Some with awe, some with worry, a few with outright irritation. As Nafisa stood on the small wooden platform at the edge of the schoolyard, she could feel the stairs carving into her skin. She clutched her notebook, thumb digging into its leather cover. Her palms were wet. Her mouth tasted like old iron. "You can sit down if you change your mind," Miss Salma whispered from behind. But Nafisa stepped forward. The murmurs hushed. She opened the notebook. The first page rustled in the breeze. Her voice trembled as she began. "I was 5 months pregnant when I lost my child." A few women shifted in their seats. One older woman shook her head. "I didn't know I was allowed to grieve out loud." More silence. Even the birds seemed to stop. "I was told to hide it. That it would bring shame. That my womb should stay quiet until it produced something worth speaking about." A young woman in the second row covered her mouth with her wrapper. An elder looked down at her hands. "I began writing because I was drowning in my own body. Because no one told me that grief could grow inside your skin." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She didn't look up, she couldn't. The paper steadied her hands. The pain steadied her purpose. She read about the ceiling at the clinic, about Musa's silence, about Safina's blood soaking the dirt. She read about nights where she sat still so no one would see her cry. Then she said it plainly. Silence is not sacred. It is not healing. It is fear, dressed in tradition. Her heart thundered. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Then, in the crowd, someone sobbed. A woman in orange lace. Nafisa had seen her before, buying palm oil near the mosque. She was crying now, shoulders shaking, face turned toward the ground. Another woman gripped her neighbor's hand. Some held their breath as if one wrong exhale might collapse the moment. And then, a voice behind the crowd. "Oh, Mel. Familiar." "I never knew what to say," he said. "But now I do." Heads turned. It was Umar, her cousin. Tall, quiet Umar. The one who had buried 2 children with his young wife years ago. No one spoke of it. "She lost them before they were born," he said. "She cried alone. I thought being silent was respectful. I thought it was strong." He paused. His eyes met Nafisa's. "But I was wrong. Strength is not silence. Strength is showing up anyway. Like she just did." A murmur passed through the women like a breeze shifting dry leaves. Nafisa's throat tightened. She closed her notebook slowly. And for the first time she looked up. She saw tears in eyes she never expected. Saw nods from women who had once only passed her like smoke. The silence, once thick with judgment, had shifted. Broken. It wasn't celebration. Not yet. Not understanding. But it was something more dangerous. Something more powerful. Recognition. That evening when she walked home, Musa walked behind her. Not in anger. Not in shame. Just quietly. When they reached the threshold of their hut, he said, "You were brave." She didn't answer. But for the first time she didn't feel like her body was a wound she had to hide. She felt like a flame. And the village had just seen the first spark. At first it was just the wind that responded. The day after Nafisa spoke, the village air was charged, as though something sacred had been broken or finally released. Some women smiled at her in the market. Others turned away. Children whispered her name like it had become a question instead of a greeting. Musa did not come home that night. When she returned from the stream, his mat was still rolled up, untouched. His prayer beads were gone. His shoes too. The silence in the hut was thick. But it wasn't like before. It wasn't grief, it was avoidance. By the next morning, news had spread as though someone had beat a drum from rooftop to rooftop. Al-Hajjah arrived before the cock crowed. "You think standing in front of the whole village makes you wise? That bleeding in public is strength?" she hissed, kicking over Nafisa's clay cooking pot with the toe of her shoe. It rolled and cracked. "You've brought disgrace," she said, her face red with heat. "You could have just had another baby." Quietly. Like women do. Nafisa said nothing. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. Words were now sacred to her. She would no longer waste them on ears closed by ego. Al-Hajjah stormed away, her voice trailing behind her like smoke. But that evening a knock came. It was faint, soft, almost like the breeze. She opened the door to find Fatima from 3 compounds away. The woman held a small bowl of shea tea. Her eyes were damp. "I lost 2 before Hadi," she said. "I never told anyone. I told my husband they were dreams." Nafisa took the bowl. She didn't need to say thank you. Their eyes had already spoken. The next day another woman came, older, her wrapper faded and her shoulders slumped from years of silence. She carried a faded fabric bundle in her arms. Inside was a tiny pair of hand-woven sandals. "I made them 7 years ago. For the one I didn't get to meet." She placed them in Nafisa's hands. "I kept them buried. But I don't want to hide any more. By the end of the week, 4 women had come. Then 6. Then 9. Some cried as soon as they sat. Others stayed quiet but returned the next day. So Nafisa cleaned the old bench behind the hut, swept the dust with a palm broom, and began setting down mats each afternoon. She called it nothing. No posters. No invitations. But every evening the women gathered. They called it the back circle, because it was behind the compound and because, for most of their lives, they had been expected to stay in the background. They brought their pain with them. Babies they had lost, husbands who blamed them, wombs that had betrayed their hopes. Nafisa did not offer solutions. She had none. She wasn't trained in healing. She didn't own sacred herbs. She had no diploma. But she had words. And she gave those freely. She taught them to write, slowly, syllable by syllable. They wrote with charcoal on scraps of old grain sacks at first. Then Miss Salma donated and used school paper. Soon, even those who couldn't write shared through speaking, and others helped them record their pain. They gave their grief names. One woman named hers Heavy Rain That Never Reached the Soil. Another called hers The Uncarried Song. They wept together, sometimes laughed together, and sometimes simply sat in stillness, because not all pain demanded sound. Each meeting felt like medicine carved from wound. Still, outside that sacred circle, the village split itself. The imam's wife called her, the girl who teaches women to disobey silence. A few men said her words would destroy marriages. Al-Hajjah told anyone who would listen that her son had married a disgrace. Even Musa kept his distance. He came home only after the circles ended each night. Sometimes he stood at the edge of the gathering, watching. Never speaking. But not leaving either. He became a question mark in her life, neither enemy nor ally. Just a silence she hadn't yet decided to confront. One evening, a teenage girl from a nearby hamlet came alone, holding a scarf soaked in blood. She had miscarried behind her schoolhouse and walked for hours to reach Nafisa. When she arrived, she collapsed in her arms. That night, Nafisa stayed awake by the girl's side, changing cloths and whispering prayers her mother once whispered to her. The other women took turns tending to her, like sisters who had waited too long to find each other. The girl lived. And when she could speak, she said, "I didn't know I was allowed to ask for help." Nafisa touched her forehead gently. "You are always allowed." As the circle grew, so did the resistance. One night, rocks were thrown into the compound. Another time, someone spat on the wall and wrote, "Womb talk is filth." Nafisa cleaned it herself the next morning. With water. And the strength of a woman who had survived both loss and rebirth. Still, she wasn't afraid. Because she had built something sacred. Not a clinic. Not a shrine. But a place where women could look at their scars without shame. And in the heart of that space she stood. Not as a leader. Not as a healer. But as proof. Proof that a woman could bleed and still speak. That she could be broken and still build something whole. That she could cry but not collapse. She was not a therapist. Just a woman who refused to die silently. And now the village had to decide. Would they bury her voice? Or begin to listen? Either way, she would not go back into the silence. Musa returned just before sunset. His shadow fell through the doorway before his body did. Nafisa was sitting on the mat, peeling roasted groundnuts into a calabash. Her hands did not pause. She didn't stand to greet him, but her heart did. He dropped his bag by the door, sat down across from her and said nothing. For a long time, the only sound between them was the snapping of shells. Then, in a voice softer than she expected, he said, "You shamed me." Nafisa looked up. Her hands were still. But her voice came steady. "No," she said. "I saved myself." The air crackled with the weight of truths too long hidden. Musa lowered his eyes. He didn't argue. He just took a groundnut from the bowl and chewed slowly, like he was tasting not food, but the words she'd spoken to the village. That night they ate dinner in silence. Not the cold, weaponized silence of anger, but the raw, unfamiliar quiet of two people who had finally taken off their masks. The days that followed moved carefully. Musa did not stop her from hosting the women. But he didn't ask about them either. He stayed longer at the market. He spoke little at meals. He rolled his prayer mat beside hers, but never asked what she was writing in her notebook anymore. Then came the following Thursday, a market day. A few of the elders had begun holding small men's gatherings near the mosque wall. At first, they spoke about grain prices, about politics, about the roads. But slowly, because of whispers from their wives and sisters, the topic changed. That week, Musa attended one. He sat under the shade of a neem tree with 10 other men, some older, some younger. He folded his arms across his chest, expecting nothing. Then the chief's nephew Idris spoke. My wife lost twins last year, Idris said. She didn't tell me for weeks. I thought she didn't care. But now I realize, I never asked her how she carried her grief. I was afraid of her tears. Another man added, I thought being strong meant staying quiet. Now I think it meant staying with her when she couldn't stop crying. They weren't perfect words. Not eloquent. Not poetic. But honest. Musa sat still. He remembered the night Nafisa bled in the dark and said nothing. The night he turned his back and called it dignity. The months she kept reaching and he kept retreating. He had been present, but not really. Not in the way she had needed. He didn't speak that day. But he listened. And something shifted. That evening he came home early. Nafisa was sitting outside with her feet in a small bowl of warm water. She didn't look up as he approached. But he sat beside her and placed a piece of roasted yam in her hand. They didn't speak. But they ate together. The next morning she found her old broken cooking pot, now patched with cow dung and rope, sitting near the firewood. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. But the message was clear. Musa began sitting with her again. Not always speaking. Not pretending to fully understand. But listening. Bringing her tea. Sweeping the yard before her circle gathered. One night as the women filed in, he stood near the fence, watching. When a teenage girl hesitated to enter, he opened the gate for her. No words, just a quiet nod. Nafisa saw it. Later that night he sat beside her and asked, Do they ever laugh in there? She smiled. Sometimes. Sometimes we even dance. He chuckled quietly, the sound dry from lack of use. I wouldn't know how to join you, he said. You don't have to, she replied gently. Just don't close the gate again. He nodded. It wasn't love in the way songs described. No flowers. No grand apologies. But it was healing, in the shape of presence. In the form of questions instead of blame. Musa had not yet unpacked all his fear. His pride still lingered like an old smell in a closed room. But something in him had begun to open. He still did not fully understand her pain. But he was no longer turning away from it. And for Nafisa that was enough. Because she wasn't asking for perfect understanding. Only companionship on the road back to wholeness. And maybe, just maybe, the road back to each other. The news traveled the way wildflowers bloom, unexpectedly, quietly, and everywhere at once. A visiting NGO volunteer named Aisha had heard whispers about a woman in the village who gathered others to speak of pain no one dared name. Curious, she slipped into one of Nafisa's evening circles, expecting a few words, maybe a few tears. What she found instead was something sacred, raw honesty woven into shared silence, laughter layered over scars, and healing stitched with every whispered story. After the session ended, Aisha waited until Nafisa began sweeping the dust from the mats. Do you know what you've done here? She asked. Nafisa shrugged. I'm not doing anything new. I'm just giving space to what already lives in our hearts. Aisha smiled, but her eyes carried excitement. 2 weeks later she returned with a team. They sat with elders, spoke to women, even listened to Musa. Slowly, gently they offered a seed. Funding for a small program. A gathering space. Not just for women who had lost pregnancies, but for anyone carrying invisible grief. They called it Voices of the Womb. The name stirred the village. Some mocked it. Others leaned in. But all were curious. With modest funding, the backroom of the school was painted a soft clay color, cushioned with mats donated by grandmothers who once believed silence was protection. The walls were adorned with handmade posters, affirmations, drawings by children, and one framed poem by Nafisa that read, Not all births end in cries. Some end in silence. But silence, too, is a sound worthy of love. Soon, Nafisa was invited to speak at other villages, then at the District Women's Council. She didn't speak like a politician. She told her story simply, gently. She carried her notebook, still scarred at the edges. She didn't dress differently. She didn't hide her trembling hands. But when she opened her mouth, people leaned in. When a local radio station heard about the program, they invited her for a Sunday broadcast. Nafisa almost said no. But Musa surprised her. You should go, he said. She looked at him. And say what? He reached for her hand, quietly, without show, and held it. Say what you've always said. Say the truth. It was the first time he had held her hand in public. The first time she had felt his presence not as a shadow behind her, but a root beside her. At the radio station, her voice trembled. She wasn't trained for microphones or listeners she couldn't see. But she closed her eyes and spoke. I was told to grieve quietly, like grief was a shameful disease, she said. I was told my womb failed, that I failed. But silence did not make me stronger. It made me disappear. So I chose to speak. And when I did, others spoke too. We became less afraid, less alone. The host was speechless. The phone lines buzzed with calls from women across villages who had no one to tell their stories to, until that moment. Back in the village, something began to shift. Not overnight. Not like a storm. But like sunlight softening hard earth. Old women who once spat at barren girls, now asked how to listen better. Midwives who only measured herbs and temperature began to ask, "How do you feel?" Girls began writing poems. Boys began sitting beside their sisters during healing circles. And the school's outer clinic wall, once faded and ignored, was painted with a mural. It showed a woman wrapped in soft yellow, holding an empty cradle. But her face wasn't sad. It was strong. Below the painting in white bold chalk, read the lines Nafisa once scribbled at midnight. The world thinks a woman is only a mother when she holds a child. But I became a mother the day I chose to hold myself. The mural became a landmark. Women from neighboring villages came to take photos beside it. Some cried. Some laughed. Some just stood in silence, touching the cradle. Nafisa didn't claim fame. She still swept the mats after every session. Still boiled hibiscus leaves for the newcomers. Still wrote new thoughts in her notebook. Musa walked with her now, never ahead, never behind. Just beside. He didn't always know the right thing to say. But he had stopped hiding. One day as they returned from the market, they passed the mural. Musa stopped. "She looks like you," he said, staring at the woman in yellow. Nafisa chuckled. "You think everyone with a head wrap looks like me?" But he didn't smile. "No," he said softer. "I mean, the way she's holding herself. Is the way you walk now. Strong. Even when empty." That night she wrote again. "The wound does not disappear. But it does not rule me. I have made peace with the echo." In the village that once swallowed her pain with shame, Nafisa had planted a sound. It was not loud. But it was lasting. And one story at a time, it softened everything it touched. The moon sat like a silver eye in the sky, soft and silent, watching as Nafisa stepped outside. The night was gentle. No winds, no stirring leaves, just the hush that comes when a village finally stops holding its breath. She walked toward the old compound, the same space where her knees once hit the ground in despair, where blood stained the red earth and nobody dared speak of it. She paused there now, not to weep but to breathe, to remember, to reclaim. In her hand she held a letter. The pages were worn at the folds, the ink smudged in places from old tears. It had taken her 3 years to write this one letter. A letter not meant for a mailbox but for the sky. She sat down slowly on the low bench, its wooden frame leaning slightly as if tired from years of holding the weight of secrets. She opened the letter. And she began to read. "My dearest little one," her voice shook slightly, "I never got to name you. Never got to cradle you or kiss your forehead or hear your first cry. But tonight I need you to hear mine." She smiled softly. "Not out of joy but out of peace. I used to believe that losing you meant losing myself. That I was no longer a woman because I did not bring you into this world. But I was wrong. You did come into the world. Not with a cry, but with a lesson. Not with a body, but with a voice. Mine." A breeze moved through the grass nearby as if listening. "I spent too long asking why. Why me? Why you? Why silence? But now I ask, what did I become because of you? The answer is this: I became a woman who could teach others how to speak. I became someone I'm proud to be. And that's a gift you gave me." She folded the letter slowly and placed it in a small clay pot she had made during one of the healing circles. Then gently she buried the pot beside the old neem tree. "I didn't bury my baby tonight," she whispered. "I buried my silence." Nafisa stood, dusted off her skirt and turned toward the school in the distance. The night had grown cooler. The moonlight lit her path. Inside the school, where blackboards once held only alphabets and arithmetic, new lessons had begun. She now taught every Tuesday and Thursday. But her subject wasn't listed in any curriculum. It was called Writing Through Pain. The first time she offered the class, only 3 girls showed up. Now they couldn't find enough benches. Girls came with broken hearts, with trembling hands, with stories they weren't sure they could say out loud. Nafisa gave them pens and paper, not to become poets but to become whole. She taught them that pain, when written, doesn't disappear, but it transforms. That the act of telling is the act of reclaiming. Sometimes she would read them parts of her own journal entries, only to hear one of the girls whisper, "That's how I feel too." And each time that happened, something healed again. One afternoon, while she was erasing the board, Al-Hajjah stepped into the classroom. The same woman who once blamed her womb, who tossed out her cooking pot, who led whispers about disgrace. Nafisa turned, unsure of what to expect. "I brought this," Al-Hajjah said, holding out a small basket. Inside was fried groundnut and a folded wrapper. "I thought maybe, for your next meeting," she added, avoiding eye contact. Nafisa took the basket quietly. "Thank you," she said. Al-Hajjah lingered, her voice lowering. "I didn't know back then. I didn't know how heavy silence could be." Nafisa nodded. "None of us did." The greeting wasn't dramatic. There were no apologies carved in tears. But from that day forward, Al-Hajjah began referring to Nafisa with a new name when speaking to neighbors. Nafisa, the one who built. Not the one who birthed. Not the one who lost. The one who built. That name stuck. Now, as the days passed, girls in the village grew up not just knowing where babies came from, but where healing did too. They knew that wounds didn't make you less. That grief could walk beside you without destroying you. That storytelling was not just survival, it was sacred. And Nafisa, at the end of each day, still wrote. Her final journal entry was penned under a flickering lantern, beside a window cracked open to the night. It was short. Honest. The truth she once feared to say. "They told me to keep quiet. But grief, when spoken, becomes healing. And silence, that is what I buried. Not my baby." She placed the pen down and looked out the window. Somewhere in the distance, a girl was probably writing her own truth tonight. Somewhere else, a husband was learning how to sit with pain instead of solving it. Somewhere further still, a woman was finally telling her story on a cracked radio with a shaky voice and a whole heart. And maybe, just maybe, the world was becoming softer. Not because everything was perfect, but because someone once stood in front of her compound and said, "I will not disappear." And that voice, that once trembled in shame, had grown louder than silence. Forever. They told her not to cry, not to speak, not to disturb the air with her loss. But she turned their silence into sentences, turned her pain into poetry, and turned her womb's emptiness into a village's awakening. She may not have birthed a child, but she birthed the truth, that no woman should have to carry grief in secret. And now, when the village speaks of strength, they do not speak of sons. They speak of Nafisa, the woman who refused to bleed quietly.